Thank you very much to the panel for sharing their views. So let me start off the first question. We're going to have some time for, and after that, we go to the list of questions. Then maybe if you have questions, let us know. We can take it from the floor. So my first question is, having listened to the presentation, you get a sense that our friends here are more concerned with data protection, security. But is that how regulators really look at cloud computing? Do they see the value, or do they look at it from more the value they can obtain? What is the opportunity? What are the threats? Or is it a case of regulators seeing cloud computing as any form of IT? As long as this new form of IT just fit into my existing frame of requirements, I don't care what you call it. So may I have the views of the panelists, please, on this matter?
You talk about what is the cloud computing, whether it brings a value. Huh? Okay, so as I said in my brief presentation, we believe that the cloud technology can bring a value to the organizations, and in my case, to the banks, because not only that the cloud computing reduces cost and therefore the banks can be more efficient, but still they can help the banks to be innovative, to compete with other banks. You know that the life cycle of development is shorter than usual, so the bank can achieve the goal of time to market and deliver the product to its customers sooner than usual, especially in the era of technology revolution, and when the use and when customers utilize their banking services via direct channels, digital channels, we think that cloud can enhance these services, and not only that the banks can compete with the other banks, but also with fintech, which that already use the cloud computing to develop and deliver for the bank's customers digital products. In that way, we also believe that the bank will be flexible, will be reactive to the changes, and really could even raise its reputation. Of course, on the other end, I'm not talking about threats, but the bank should be aware of the relevant risks of cloud, like information and security risks, like cyber risk, and of course, and other like business continuity, and of course, legal and regulatory risk, and others. And of course, not just to take them in account and to assess them on a continuous, on daily basis, and of course, mitigate them as long as he can do it. But again, as I said, cloud computing, we believe, although we are the regulator, that it's a business enabler for the banks for the reason I've just said. Okay?
I agree with Rachel. First of all, from the privacy perspective, we can view cloud storage as a threat, as a risk. I mean, more people have access to the information, personal information of the organization. The data is in transit. Cloud providers are a better target for hackers than an uninteresting local server of an Israeli organization. However, to say as an Israeli regulator nowadays that you should not use cloud services from the privacy perspective, I don't think it's realistic anymore. So what we would suggest that you should make sure that the cloud service provider complies with the Israeli law, meaning that your data subject will have access to the information, meaning that for example, he will be willing to delete all the personal information when your contract will end, and just make sure he complies with all the regulation of the Israeli law.
Hi. I think that, as I mentioned in my presentation, with the right configuration, the cloud can be more secured from some organizations, but it should be configured very well. We know that the cloud providers have huge units of security experts, so with the right configuration, it could be very useful.
I'll add on as well. We're not a regulator, however, we get asked by regulators all the time about our thoughts about different types of threats. And so we actually just launched a forum just for regulators and supervisory authorities and central banks. It's called CERES, the CERES. And one of the things they told us they wanted to talk about was issues like cloud security and data privacy issues across borders, because a chance to have a little bit of what they call harmonization, to have a little bit of understanding what other people are doing, because if you have a cloud server in one country and you have the data controller in a different country, but the data of personal people are on the server comes from dozens of countries, then what rules do you need to follow? And so this is something that they wanted to talk about. So they have a little bit of understanding what's going on, because if Israel, for instance, requires the information to be deleted upon request, but a different country actually has a completely opposite regulation, then you're stuck in the middle. And so this is a forum to be able to talk about these types of issues.
That also our directive dealing with cloud computing, one of the provisions refers to the contract between the cloud provider and the bank, and the bank, I mean, according to this directive, can unilaterally terminate the association with the provider, and of course this provider should have the obligation to delete the data, even to transfer it either to the bank's frames or to other service provider frames, and of course not to have the ability to retrieve that data in the future. So if a bank cannot comply, I mean the service provider, because we don't supervise the service, the cloud providers, but if the bank cannot comply with this provision, it's quite an issue. We cannot go to the cloud, okay?
Okay, besides data protection, security, what are your thoughts on your ability to trust the provider, issues like cross-border data transfer, and other issues that you have not been raised yet so far?
You know, when we deal with cloud computing risk, I believe that one of the material risks is command and control. Command and control the application of the banks. What do I mean? The ability of the bank to control its activity of the cloud, it's really limited. Let's face it. It's not the same as if the application resides on his frame. So it doesn't have sufficient knowledge of the risk management processes of the service providers. Sometimes, you know, the culture of risk management is not similar to the culture of the banks. Naturally, the bank is regulated. And therefore, I believe the bank has a concern that sensitive data will be exposed, there will be a leak. And I mean, for example, there is a concern, as you mentioned, legal and regulatory authorities. For example, if for example, governmental authorities requires the provider to expose the customer's data, will the provider notify the bank? Can the bank do anything about it? Can it prevent it? I'm not sure it does. Another example, what happens if there is a breach on the premise of the on the cloud of the cloud provider? Will it notify the bank? When will it notify? What kind of details is going to provide to the bank? So when we talk with sensitive, confidential data which is stored on the public cloud, it's really a concern. But again, I believe that the bank can manage and should manage also those aspects of risk related to the fact that the data is stored on the premise of cloud, of the public cloud.
One concern, it's where is the data located? Here in Israel, all the location, it's abroad. It's not in Israel. And we will be happy to see one of the large providers build a data center here in Israel in case of you need to do forensics or get the data, or in, I don't know, any case of that you don't have connection to other countries. This is one of the issues.
Sit down somewhere. If not, then we move to the next question. Okay, next question is, as regulators, what are the tools or mechanisms you have at your disposal to ensure that enterprises that are under your jurisdiction ensure that cloud adoption is safe?
Okay, the regulators, so I guess that the tools of the tools, you know, are not different principally from the traditional supervisory tools, maybe with the needed adaptations. For example, the banks are required, according to a specific directive, to notify us on every cyber incident. There is a specific directive which requires the banks to notify us within 3 hours since they identify the incident, and it's not a one-time notification, but they are expected to notify us according to the progress of the incidents every 8 hours, and even earlier if they are asked by us to do that. So, of course, we examine the way the bank investigates the incident, the circumstances that enabled the incident to occur, of course, to draw lessons, etc. Sometimes we even require the banks to submit an investigation report. But there are many other tools. For example, there is on-site examination, there is evaluation on a daily, continuously basis. We have meetings with the relevant functions in the bank, cyber defense officers, chief cyber defense officer, risk management, and other members sometimes of the senior management. Of course, we send letters with requirements which I cannot elaborate. We also if we conduct exercises, cyber exercises with the banks. So we even in our directive, there is a possibility, a provision that can enable us to conduct an audit on the premise of the cloud provider if and when needed, of course in special cases. So we usually use the same supervisory tools with the needed adaptations, as you said.
Dealing with the Israeli companies that have data stored in the cloud storage is one aspect, is one part of the equation. But how do we deal with the service providers themselves? As Eli described, by the way, there are several Israeli cloud providers that claim that they have the same data protection as abroad. At least I heard it myself. I don't know if you can believe it, but that's what I heard. So how do you tackle the service providers, which are international providers, global giants? So first of all, I think you should try and make sure that your contract with them complies with all the relevant regulations and laws, either ours or Rachel's. And second, I think that it's an easy statement to say, but it's hard to tell Microsoft, okay, I'm a nice Israeli customer from Israel, and I want you to change the generic contract so it will be compatible with the Israeli law. But I think we are seeing changes not only because of the GDPR. I think the GDPR is part of it, but I can assure you that there are new legislations all over the world dealing with data protection and privacy. And GDPR is only one of them. And that makes these global giants more aware, more willing to change their contracts, more willing to provide you with on-site inspection, sending your auditor to check whether the services they provide actually comply with Israeli law. For example, I think, Teresa, and you can verify, for example, US cloud providers now give you the option if you want to store the information in Europe. In Europe, the GDPR applies. The GDPR, and if you hold your information in Europe, they are under the GDPR, and therefore it should be more protected and more private. So these are relevant options.
Also, another thing that you can take care of, it's from the organization point of view. So as I mentioned, baseline guidance and requirements, minimum requirements, will do the work also.
And I would say one of the tools that we've seen emerging quite a bit throughout the world is penetration testing, mandated by the regulator or supervisory authority. So a couple years ago in the United Kingdom, we had something called CBEST, and it was at first voluntary, but then quickly became mandatory, where the regulator came and told all the banks, you have to get penetration tested and to see if you have any vulnerabilities, and then you're supposed to get a report card that tells you what you need to work on. This idea has really hooked into the world, and now we have EU TIBER. So the EU now is looking at mandatory penetration testing as well. This is being more modeled off of the Dutch version of TIBER, where you're going to start having all these countries talking about it. Hong Kong's talked about it, Singapore's talked about it. So suddenly this is becoming much more of an interesting idea. Now, there's no set scenario necessarily for the penetration test. However, one of the I guess, tenets for red teaming is that you have to look at all your significant applications and scan them for vulnerabilities and assess whether or not they can be vulnerable to attack. And people do put cloud servers into this category now more and more. And Raquel, you mentioned exercising, and exercising is a brilliant way to be able not just to test it in theory, but to test it in practice as well. Because what we have found is that whenever the incident does happen, people aren't prepared for it, and they make mistakes, and they say things to the press that, you know, they should have waited until they got the information, until they talked to the press and things like that, and it just makes it worse, and it makes public panic, and the reputation of the sector downgrades as a whole, just because they weren't prepared for it. So things like exercising really does help prepare your team of how are they going to handle this, and in that sense also talk to your third parties. You know, most banks have hundreds of third parties that they use. So make sure that you have those third party assessments updated, that you're talking to those third parties, and you act out the exercise. If there was an attack on your cloud servers and something was exposed, work with your actual provider on exercising that out, and how would that communication take place? How long would it take for them to give you the information, and how would you jointly work with the media to get the information out to the public?
Okay, thank you very much to the panelists. I'm afraid we ran out of time, so it isn't time for me to ask a question from the floor. So on that note, thank you very much to the panelists for a good, excellent presentation.
Thank you guys very much.